my granny.
This is my grandmother.
And this is my grandma.
Seniors are very important.
I love you, Babcha. We need you.
You are loved.
When the sun is bright or in the darkest night, we're all in this together. I've got many friends, and you are one of them. We're all in this together. It will be okay. Ça va bien aller.
Ça va bien aller.
I've got many songs to sing, won't you? Sing them too, sing them too.
Hi, my name's Louise Penny. I want to welcome you to the first episode of Author Conversations and also welcome you to my village of Knowlton. And I'm actually, I don't know if you can see, but I'm in the bookstore, and it's a little family-run independent bookstore, but a really a marvelous one, and it's run by some friends, Danny and Lucy Macaulay and their family.
Hi, I'm Danny.
And I'm Lucy.
Welcome to Brome Lake Books.
Come on in.
I have to tell you, when Still Life, as you probably know, the first book came out, and nobody knew that it existed. And Brome Lake Books was the only bookstore that held an event for me. And I think it was me, my husband, and the bookstore owners. That was it. Fortunately, I'm not easily humiliated, because actually if I was, I would not have continued in a career as a writer.
Brome Lake Books is connected to Louise because when she first started her series in Still Life, we were her local bookstore, and she's been coming to us to do an event every year. But we've become fast friends over the years, and we've almost become part of the team because we welcome so many of her fans here at Brome Lake Books. They've been coming from all over the world for years now, and we have launches for each of her titles. Including, we have important guests like Sheila Rogers, who comes by and does interviews with Louise, and also the Clintons, which was quite an event when they came by with their whole entourage of Secret Service, and quite something different for our little tiny bookstore in our tiny little town. So Louise has been quite an event, should we say.
I was actually in New York City, just when things began to fall apart. I was at a funeral for a friend. It was packed, of course. We were cheek by jowl, and we had begun to hear sort of rumors about a virus, but nothing too specific. And then we went to a celebration of her life at one of the people's apartments, and it was even more packed. And I remember only one person there, and she was actually my editor, so it was filled with publishing people who were pretty suspect to begin with. But now there's a virus to contend with as well. But again, it wasn't really serious. No one really took it seriously except one person who happened to be my publisher, and he was doing elbow bumps. And we all thought, we didn't laugh at his face, but we certainly laughed behind his back, thinking, well, that's a little silly, overreacting. And within a week, it was clear that was a vast underreaction to what was actually happening. I went to a hockey game, again, just throbbing with people. No masks, no social distancing, no disinfectant. No, I don't think we even talked about the virus. And within days, the border was closing. By the time I got across the border, I had to be in quarantine for 14 days and how quickly everything collapsed. And I know we all feel the same way. And it's the great shared experience where we all went through the same thing and felt essentially the same thing, that fear of how far it was going to collapse and when it was going to stop and how bad it was going to get. How does it even spread? I mean, I remember there was a big debate over face masks, and then there weren't any face masks, and people were wrapping. I remember going to the store with a T-shirt around my mouth, and it was terrifying. And then we're stuck inside, and I had nothing to do. I had just finished one book, as it was the All the Devils Are Here, and I hadn't planned to start the next book for another 6 weeks or so. I was going to take some time off and relax. But I was bored, just so bored, stupid. So I decided to start the next book that's going to be coming out later on this year. And that was a blessing because it gave me something to do and some place to put my mind and a sense of control, because, of course, I can control the world that I've created of Three Pines. And I created the characters as people whose company I would enjoy, and this was 17, 18 years ago. And I had, of course, no idea that would be the saving grace, that I would have to enjoy their company for the next 6 weeks or 6 months. And I do, and I did. And it's been a blessing to be able to hang around Armand and Renbury and the other characters and villagers of Three Pines. And as we go along, you'll get to know me a little bit better, I hope, and you'll see that I know they're fictional characters. I don't want to be too precious about this whole thing. But they feel very real to me, and never more so than in the pandemic. But it was hard to focus. It was. I found it difficult writing the first, probably 100 pages or so, because I was distracted. I felt not quite myself. And then I was able to settle in, as most of us were, get into that rhythm, the new normal. But it's been uncomfortable. But it's also been very inspiring to see. I remember being in tears watching, I don't know if you remember early on in the pandemic, it was Italy, which was the first that was hardest hit. Their Air Force did flybys for all the people who were stuck. And the people would go out on their balconies and sing to each other. And I remember being almost in tears, being so moved by that sense, that yearning. And that's really what I write about in the books, is our yearning for community, the primal desire to belong, to connect, and all the creative ways people found to connect when we had to be distanced. And there were the bells that rang out in Banff, the children in Quebec doing all the rainbows and writing "Ça va bien aller," and all the ways that we managed to come together when we couldn't come together. It was incredibly moving and inspirational, and comforting to know that in many ways the worst can happen, but we can still find ways to come together, much like this. You know, we're not sitting together, and yet Bobby Joe and others have found a way to bring us all together anyway. And that's a beautiful thing. One thing that's become clear to me, not simply in this pandemic, but in my 62 years, and through, you don't get gray in your hair without having been through a certain amount of, triumphs, but also loss and grief and whatnot, challenges. I guess for me, the thing that I need to remember, and don't always, and how the light gets in for me. And there's that, obviously, the Leonard Cohen quote of ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. And it was a bit about what I was describing before. The world was shattered. We were shattered. We were all shattered by what happened. And yet those moments, those luminous moments of hope and of comfort that shone through, no matter what was happening, no matter what craziness was happening in terms of some decisions that were being made and not made, and some people who weren't being socially responsible. But for the most part, there was light. We found it within ourselves. And for me, it really, and again, I have to admit, I don't always remember this, but it starts with gratitude for me, of just being aware, we live in Canada. We live in Canada. How lucky is that? How lucky is that when you take a look again at how other countries have handled this crisis? And I can't say that Quebec has been perfect. I mean, there have been some shameful examples, particularly within senior citizens' homes and care homes, that is just absolutely appalling. Yeah, but for the most part, there's been such goodwill, and gosh, I'm so grateful to be Canadian, and to live where I live. I mean, I'm lucky to live in this wonderful community of Knowlton. Spent many years with the CBC, CBC Radio, hosting programs. But the fact is, I had, from the age of 8, wanted to be a writer. And I can tell you exactly when it began. And I know you're thinking, oh my God, she's 62 and now she's going back to when she's 8. It's going to take forever. But, you're very fortunate that this story actually happens to be riveting. So, here goes. Hang on. But I was 8, and I was a fearful child. I came out of the womb afraid of everything, and I was never, thankfully, given a reason to be afraid. It was just part of who I was. And as a result, I really withdrew from the world, and the only place I ever wanted to be was in my room, alone, door closed, feet up on the bed, reading. And honestly, it's still my favorite place in the world. But it got so bad that if I was naughty, which wasn't very often, as punishment, my mother would send me outside to play. So all I wanted to do was read. And you've probably bought this book for your grandchildren. You probably read it yourself. And for me, the turning point was when I was reading Charlotte's Web. And as I said, I was afraid of everything, but probably my cardinal fear was spiders. So I'm halfway through Charlotte's Web, and it's possible I was a slightly slow child, because at some stage it occurred to me that Charlotte's a spider. And I loved Charlotte, and I wanted nothing bad to happen to her, and yet spiders were my cardinal fear, I'm probably verging on a phobia. And something happened in that instant, and I can still remember feeling the nubbly bedspread underneath my hand and holding the book and looking at the words. And what happened in that instant is that my main fear, the thing I was most afraid of in this world, disappeared because of the book, because of the story, because of the power of words, the power of storytelling. And for a fearful child to have the most fearful thing disappear was magic. It was magic beyond imagining. And I wanted part of that. And I knew from that moment on I would be a lifelong reader. But I also understood that if reading is that powerful, how wonderful must writing be? And so I felt at that moment, that's what I want to be. I want to be a writer. But, not all my fears were lifted by reading Charlotte's Web. I then became afraid to become a writer. It's not very helpful. So I then went through life not quite becoming a writer. It's a bit like one of the themes from Waiting for Godot, where they talk about that maybe it's best that a dream not be attempted. Because what happens if you can't do it? Then you lose the dream. What happens if you find out you can't be a ballerina, you can't be an Olympic athlete, that you're a very, very bad musician and a terrible writer? I mean, that would be heartbreaking. So I thought, you know what, maybe it's best not to have it tested. I mean, I can't say that this was a conscious decision at all on my part. It wasn't. But it certainly was one of the driving forces, fear. Fear has been an element, as I say, in my life, most of my life. And it's a terrible master. It's very limiting. So I became a journalist, which was close enough. There was an element of writing, certainly of storytelling, but it wasn't the fiction writing that I really wanted to be doing. So I did it for about 20 years, lived in Toronto, in Thunder Bay, in Winnipeg, moved to Quebec City, then to Montreal, hosting CBC radio programs all the way along, current affairs shows. Some of you may have listened to it. The 1 o'clock time signal, quite famous for that. The sound of the long dash following 10 seconds of silence. It will be exactly 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Beep. You're welcome. Then I covered I covered a lot of Quebec politics, and I covered the last referendum. And that was crushing. Nobody came away from that feeling good. Everybody felt shattered. I think everybody felt bruised. And I just thought, enough. I can't do this anymore. I was burned out. I became the sort of person I would not want to work with. And that's a problem because I have to work and live with myself all the time. So I thought something's got to change. Clearly the Canadian broadcasting isn't going to. And I came home one day and my lovely husband, Michael, said, I know that you've always wanted to be a writer. If you want to quit work and write, he said the most wonderful thing, almost as wonderful as the first time he said, I love you. He said, I will support you. And he did. Thank God he meant financially. But he also supported me emotionally when nobody else believed in me. He never questioned. And so that's how I made the transition. It wasn't a conscious, I'm going to do this, then that will lead to this, and then that will lead to that. It really was almost kind of backing into it, and by the kindness of friends and Michael, and then just the universe falling into place. But that's how I became a writer. Now, getting published is a whole other thing, but I have no desire to make a distinction between people who are published by recognized publishers and those who are self-published. I have such respect for anyone who just finishes a book, just writes the end. I mean, it's hard enough to start a book. I know it took me 45 years to start the book and then to actually finish it, because most people stop about 3 or 4 chapters in because they lose momentum, they lose focus, suddenly it's hard, and they give up. So to actually get to the end of a book, well, God bless you for getting that far. So I celebrate anyone who manages to get that far, because I know how much courage it took and takes. Why did I write crime? That is a wonderful question, because I could tell you, one element of that answer. I initially, my idea when I quit the CBC and Michael supported me and made the big announcement that I was going to write, I may have intimated that I was going to write the best book ever written. Because part of my worldview or self-view at the time, and if I'm not careful, it can still creep in, is that if I'm not the best, then why bother? And that's quite crippling and can be very paralyzing. And it was for me, because I realized I probably can't write the best book ever. So here I am. I have everything. I have a supportive husband. I'm not working full time. I have a laptop. I have a pen. I have a notebook. And nothing was happening. And then a few things had to fall into place. As always, when I was a journalist and covered terrible events, whether it's a car crash or a plane crash or some tragedy has happened, that appears to happen out of the blue. And the fact is, and I know you probably know this, I know you know it, is that it's actually a series of smaller events, often overlooked, that have to fall into place in order for that final thing to happen. Well, the same is true for me with wonderful things in my life. And so a series of things had to happen to break that need to write the best book and the subsequent paralysis, the writer's block, that lasted for years. One thing was moving out of Montreal into this smaller town where I felt I could breathe. I fell in with a group of very creative women, and that's always been a big thing in my life, is choosing my company wisely and carefully. I'm a very private person, so I'll never be the sort of person with a gazillion friends, but those I do have are very close, and I try to choose them very carefully because of that. But I fell in with this group of women, les girls. We'd get together once a month, and we would talk about our process. And some are poets and dancers and musicians and artists. So it's all different forms of creativity, but the taproot is essentially the same. And I wasn't writing at the time, but they allowed me a place at the table, which was incredibly generous. And I got to see their process, and I got to see some wonderful triumphs, wonderful events, but I got to see things that didn't work out all that well. But really what I got to see was that while everyone wanted, obviously, a success, that not having a triumph didn't kill them, didn't cripple them, didn't stop them. They still got out of bed and walked down Main Street with their head held high. And that's what I finally had to see, was that the trying and failing wouldn't kill me. It was the not trying that was going to kill me. And so that was one big element. The other element was I finally sat down on my bed, which seems to be my sacred place, because all my great epiphanies happen, it seems, in bed. Michael used to call me a horizontalist, because I would spend most of my time just trying to put my feet up somewhere. But I looked on the bedside table, and this is so banal. I looked on the bedside table, and there, like many people, probably yourself, because you belong to this book club, I read small c Catholically. I read fiction and nonfiction and poetry and cookbooks and all sorts of things, literary fiction. But very well represented was crime fiction, which my mother introduced me to. So I had such affection for crime fiction. It was the first adult book that my mother and I shared. I still remember, it was an Agatha Christie. I remember coming up the stairs, and she was standing just outside their bedroom, and she had this book that she'd just finished, and she'd just closed it, and it was still warm from her hands. And she looked at me and she said, I think I was about 11 or so, and she said, "Here, I think you'll like this." It was one of those amazing moments, like the passing of the sword, that my mother and I shared a book, and I could hardly wait to read it. I read it all the way through, and then we talked about it. So I have such a warm spot in my heart for crime fiction. But I looked on the bedside table. By now I'm 45, right? Look on the bedside table, and very well represented was crime fiction. And I had one of those aha moments where I realized that I had been trying to impress other people for most of my life, trying to get approval, approbation, being afraid of disapproval, being afraid of failure. And I realized that if I wanted to get to where I needed to be in my life, if I was going to achieve my dreams, I had to set that aside. I had to not care about what others think and just do it for myself. And so I went downstairs and I drew a map of Three Pines. And the first thing I created was the bookstore. And then right next to it, the bistro. And then next to it, the boulangerie. And then the general store. And then I peopled it with all sorts of characters whose company I would enjoy. Friends, many inspired by friends. Because I thought there's very little chance the book would actually be published. I knew that what the chances are that a book be published. And the only reward I would get would be in the writing of it, the creating. The years, the 2 or 3 years it would take to write the thing would be the only reward I would get. So I bloody well better enjoy it. So every decision I made was selfish. And this I started writing just after 9/11 in 2001, obviously. And that figured into it, not into the actual storyline. It was Still Life, was the first book. But into the decisions I made, because it became clear, I think, to the world after 9/11 that no place is safe, that anything can happen. There is no such thing as safety. Anything can happen to any of us at any time. So there's no guarantee of physical safety. But we can go a great distance toward an emotional safety, toward a spiritual safety, toward a psychological core and balance. And the way we do that is by having a community around us, whether it is real and visceral or whether it's virtual, much like what you're doing now. What we've all tried to do in this pandemic is create a sense of belonging, of community. And that way, our spirits are safe, if not our bodies. And that's what I wanted to create in the village of Three Pines. Was the books aren't about murder. The murder is the Trojan horse that allows me to explore all these other issues. And the main issue, the heart and core of the books, is about belonging and about our innate goodness. And I spent a lot of time as a journalist, because I'd covered so many dreadful events, believing that the world was a scary place filled with unpleasant people. And that's simply not true. The world is a beautiful place, and it's filled with good people trying to be decent and sometimes failing, often failing. I know I've failed many times. But there is that desire to be decent. And so that's where the stories came from. And it became it was always going to be crime fiction, because I understood what crime fiction, I understood what was behind it, what drove it. And I liked that idea of almost like the passion play of the good and the evil and the gray zones in between. The books are about, as I said, they're not really, I mean, they are proudly crime novels, but really the crime is the catalyst. The books are in many ways about duality. Three Pines, the village, is an intentionally idyllic, almost hyper-idyllic setting. And again, it's intentional. Everything that happened is intentional. And then there is the crime. So you get the two sides of it. These beautiful cottages, but you don't know what's happening behind the door. We have no idea. You know, we could see someone's face, but we don't know what's happening in their head. That gap that exists between what we say and what we really think, between our words and our feelings, that gap, that's the duality. That's what I try to explore, the humanity in our lives, in our relationships. And that's what crime fiction allows. Crime fiction is an exciting field. And I rail against this idea that it's not literary fiction. I think it is. I think it can be. I think that there's a whole lot of literary fiction that is not, frankly, very good. And there's a whole lot of crime fiction that is fantastic, beautiful, thoughtful, rich. And it's a big tent, which is nice. There's crime fiction that is what would be considered cozies, like Agatha Christie's. And then there are noirs, there are darker ones, there are police procedurals. There's something for everyone. And that's exciting as well. So yeah, the crime fiction allows me to explore all the things that I want to explore. And as a result, the book 17 is out, book 18 is coming. I could write about it forever because these characters, it's exploring the characters. And just as I haven't gotten tired of my friends, I haven't gotten tired of the characters, never got tired of Michael. And Michael is the inspiration for the main character, Chief Inspector Gamache. So I think that's why crime fiction. But at the same time, I understand I haven't perhaps answered the core question of why do I read crime fiction? I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's a theory that it's because things are tied up nicely, that there is a resolution, that evil is punished and good will triumph, that there is an order to the world in crime fiction that doesn't necessarily exist in our real lives. And that certainly could be part of it. To be fair, that's not necessarily, the world I create isn't quite that neat, and it's not quite so tidily tied up. And I don't want it to be. So I still struggle with that because I don't consider myself a violent person at all. In fact, just the opposite. So who knows? The darkest time in my life, as I just said, I talked about being very lonely and fearful, and I think that led to. I realized I couldn't go through life like that, but I didn't have the tools to be able to really function fully in society, and so. I brought all my problem-solving skills to bear and decided that the answer was to drink. How's that? So that's what I did. I drank for 15 years and became an alcoholic, which wasn't funny, and it wasn't fun. It was at first, and it did the job at first, and then it turns like any addiction, and it begins to eat away at you. Not simply physically, which it does, but emotionally. It plays terrible games with your perception. And I got to the stage when I was about 35 where I knew that I wasn't even halfway through life. And I used to look at people who were older, who were my age now, or older, and wonder how they did it. How did they get to 60, 70, 80? How do you do that? I didn't know because I knew that I couldn't, and I thought, I'm in so much pain. I'm going to have to do myself in, and it wouldn't be a cry for help. This was going to be. I just wanted it to end. I subsequently realized from talking to others and from getting into recovery, was that I didn't actually want to die. I just didn't know how to live. And I wanted the pain to end. I wanted it was aching. The loneliness was terrible. It was like in a chasm. It was a dreadful, dreadful experience. And there didn't seem to be any way out. Thankfully, I realized obviously that the problem was the drinking. I initially thought, get this, I initially thought the problem was smoking. How could that be the problem? But I think in my head I knew that the problem was drinking, but I didn't really want to admit that. So the thing that had brought me to the brink of ending my own life was cigarettes. So I quit smoking, which was a bit of a miracle, of course, but that actually did not solve this loneliness and depression. And then I just realized it. I had to stop drinking. So I called up a 12-step program. And on January 2nd, 1994, I went to a meeting It was the scariest thing I've ever done. It was in the church basement in Montreal, St. Leon's Church. And I sat down at a table and 2 women joined me. One sat on either side. They introduced themselves. And then they talked to each other, and they didn't exclude me, but they were clearly talking about their holidays and whatnot, and they were laughing, and they talked about their drinking. And they, not over the holidays, but what used to be like when they were drinking. And they were laughing about it. And then they were laughing about recovery. They were laughing. They were joyous. And they were talking about things that I was so ashamed of. And they were talking as though there was no problem, that it was perfectly natural. And I remember feeling at that moment, for the first time in years, I felt hope, that there was a way out. I didn't quite know what the way out was, but I knew there was a way out. And I asked one of the women there to be my sponsor, and I joined a group, and I've been sober since. And I don't want to, I won't go into great depth because this isn't about alcoholism and recovery, but I am a big believer in asking for help. And I've done that several times in my life. And help has always been there. You reach out, there's a hand that's going to be reaching down. And then, obviously, it's incumbent on me to be that hand. And how rewarding that is, to be able to do for others what others have done for me. I thought the best of life was behind me, and I could not have been more wrong. I was 35 when that happened, and within a year I met the love of my life. Within 3 years I was married. Within 5 years I was writing the book. And now, Michael is gone. He died. He had dementia, which was awful, of course. But I still consider myself the luckiest person on earth. Well, it is interesting that what we are living right now is, in many ways, I think most of us do feel like that we are suspended, waiting for life to happen, that it's difficult. I mean, not being able to see children and grandchildren, not except virtually, thank God for Zoom and others and FaceTime, but it's not the same thing. But it's better than nothing. It's still, life came out of that understanding that if you're not growing, you're actually going backward. And growth isn't the same as change. It's evolution. It's learning. It's being educable. It's being open to the world. And yet, so many people, or a number of people, are resistant to that. They want nothing to change. They're just, everything's fine. I don't want to move. I don't want anything to happen with the job. I don't want, my wife or my husband to grow. They find things very challenging and very threatening. It's about the need to be open to growth and how much of a prison it is to be afraid. The role of fear in our lives, and that striving to keep everything perfect and as it is. So that's really where still life comes from, and it's obviously a play on, because it also looks at the art world and a particular painting that is a still life. But the theme and the theory and the philosophy behind it is that need to always evolve and grow. My initial idea, now remember, I didn't think the books would be published, but my initial idea was, if I was lucky enough to be published, that they would all be set in this village of Three Pines. But it became fairly clear fairly quickly that once the books were published and I was into 3 or 4, that the little village couldn't sustain the murder rate. And in fact, to be fair, and because like, a lot of people sort of laugh at all the murders that happen in this little village, and most of the murders do not actually happen in Three Pines. The main characters happen to live there, and so they're discussing it, and the chief inspector ends up going to the bistro a lot to talk to people. But anyway, it did become clear that it was probably a good idea to set some books outside of Three Pines, and so I've done that a few times. It's also very exciting for me as a writer, because it gives me a chance to explore different areas and describe different areas. So one was set at a monastery not too far from here. Actually, it was inspired by that monastery, Saint-Benoît-du-Lac. And one was set in Quebec City, primarily in Quebec City. And then I thought it really is time to take the characters completely out of Quebec and take them to Paris. And the reason for Paris, even though it's not a city I knew all that well, was because Gamache's son and daughter-in-law and grandchildren live in Paris. And so it seemed natural. And another character had moved there, and they were about to have another child. And so it seemed a good time for Gamache and Reine-Marie, his wife, to move. Not to move, but to travel to vacation in Paris. And so that did get... One of the challenges in writing a series with essentially the same setting and the same core characters is not by mistake writing the same book over and over, falling into a format, becoming formulaic. And I have no interest in doing that. I don't have to write. I write because it brings me joy and because it challenges me. It is such an interesting thing to wake up to every day, this creation. But I don't want to churn them out like they're sausages. I don't have to. I don't want to. But the challenge is how to make sure you don't. And I have a lot of writer friends, and none of them does it on purpose. No one becomes formulaic, or very few become formulaic on purpose. But you can still get into a rut by happenstance. And so I tried to do two things to mitigate against that. One is to choose different themes, and I choose the themes based often on poetry. I read a lot of poetry, and I find in poetry certain couplets, certain ideas, certain thoughts. But the other way is to also move the characters slightly outside of their comfort zone, and therefore outside of my comfort zone, and really push myself as a writer. And Paris really did that. I had to go there a few times. I know, a hardship, to research it, and took some friends with me. The first time I went there was with Michael, and I was a little bit worried about returning after he had died, because it's painful to revisit places that had been meaningful with someone you loved and love. So I went with some good friends who knew Paris well and who would be good company. And they introduced me to... I didn't want to have every scene in the Louvre or the Eiffel Tower or the Luxembourg, Les Jardins. I wanted to find some little hidden gardens, little hidden areas, little hidden restaurants that you wouldn't necessarily find, but that actually exist. And so that's what we did. We explored Paris, and it was joyous. And it was wonderful. It's very meaningful to me. It's necessary for me to be in a city, and I suspect for you too. It's a different experience if you are in a city with someone who knows the city well and is passionate about it. Because my fear when I moved the books from Three Pines, which is inspired by where I live, and I love it. It is actually love letters to Quebec, love letters to Canada, love letters to the Eastern Townships, to the village that has been my home and been so welcoming and so comforting. But if I moved the stories out of Three Pines, which other people have also bonded with because of the books, and moved it to Paris, that people wouldn't feel the same bonding, wouldn't feel as attached. So what I had to do was I had to fall in love with Paris. and then be able to transmit that love, that passion onto the page. And it took a couple of trips. I mean, I love the Paris with Michael, but that couldn't be what I wrote about. And it was a risk, but it was a risk worth taking, and it was time to do it. And in the process, it's almost an origin story for Gamache, the main character, where we learn more about how he became the man he is and what happened in his childhood and the people he loves, not just his wife and children, but the people who have been in his life all of his life. And so that was fun to explore as well. I was born and raised in Toronto. Although when I was 8, we moved to Montreal, and I spent 4 years going to school here. We rented a place in the Laurentians, and they were the happiest times of my life, young life growing up. And then I moved around to various places, as I said, with CBC. But I got tired of that. I yearned for home. I yearned to put down roots. I yearned for belonging, to be able to make friends who I knew would be lifelong friends and not just 2 or 3 years. And so I thought, where's home? Where was I happiest? And it was Quebec. Even though I was unilingual English, hadn't lived in Quebec since I was 12, hadn't visited Quebec since I was 12. But I knew in my heart that Quebec was where I belonged. And so I came back and lived in Quebec City and then moved to Montreal, got sober in Montreal, met Michael in Montreal, and then moved down here to the townships, where neither Michael nor I had ever lived, but we wanted to start a life together and explore an area together, get to know it together, not some place where Michael had roots, but I didn't, or vice versa. And we were embraced immediately. And as someone who'd been searching all of her life, as I have, for home, to find it was profound. I found home with Michael, and I found home here. And we settled down, we got dogs, we made friends. This was back in just before 2000. And so I wanted to reflect that in the books, that joy, that overwhelming comfort at finding home. And that's why they're love letters to this area. I feel as though the Eastern Townships, specifically in Quebec in general, had just been saving a place at the table for me. And then when things started going bad, when Michael got ill, and he was the head of hematology at the Montreal Children's Hospital. He was born and raised in Montreal. His family was. He was a lifelong Montrealer, bilingual. Just a really remarkable man and brilliant, a researcher in children's cancers as well. And wouldn't you know it, he would develop dementia, which was just incredibly cruel. But people here, they'd come by and they'd visit and sit with him, and even when he couldn't talk anymore, he'd look at them and smile, and they'd smile at him. And at no stage, we had parties, and Michael would, come out in his wheelchair, and he'd smile at them, and nobody treated him like anything bad had happened. And I think about that, and I still feel teary. And that's what this is. How can I not celebrate this place? And if nobody else feels as I do about it, that's fine, because I do. And I wanted to bring that element. I mean, Quebec isn't perfect, obviously. I said, I quit work because I couldn't take the politics anymore. But the fact is, in real life, I don't know if this has been your experience, but it certainly is in mine, I have never been made to feel unwelcome. Never, not once. And, I've struggled with French, and now my French is thank God, is okay. But I remember what was it? Oh God, I called Quebecers good pumpkins for reasons that I think I was going for citoyen and got to citron or something. I asked a taxi driver to take me to the war. I wanted to order 1,000, one millefeuille, and I ended up ordering 1,000 mille-fois, millefeuille. Who knew there was such a difference? But you know that you just said something really stupid, not because nobody ever said, "Oh, you're an idiot." They looked like they were terrified because they were clearly in the presence of someone who was insane. But this is home, and that's what I wanted to reflect, and I love it for that. I love the fact that Michael is spread all over Quebec, and I will be one day as well. The books are now translated in 31 languages, sold all around the world, and I think the reason for the popularity is because, au fond, we all want to belong. We all want to feel safe. We all want a community around us. We all want to be loved, to have friends. So it doesn't matter whether you're in Estonia or Arizona or here in Quebec. There is that universal yearning. Everybody has responded to Three Pines that way.
As a way of keeping track of the fans and where they're from, we started to do a map. So we have now installed a map on our wall of the world, and fans have started putting pins in where they're from, all the way from Australia and Tasmania and Europe, and in the Far East as well. And so Louise's popularity just is bounds everywhere across the whole globe.
It was very important to me that in every book, save for the one set in Paris, that there be no doubt where it's set. There's no sort of this could be anywhere in the world. No, within the first paragraph, often within the first sentence, it is set in Quebec. Absolutely no question. And that's important. Sense of place. This place, Quebec, is as much a character in these books as Armand Gamache, the head of homicide for the Sûreté du Québec, as much as Ruth Zardo, this crazy poet, as much as Myrna Landers, the bookstore owner who used to live in Montreal and retired down to found Three Pines by mistake. Because Three Pines isn't on any map. Again, it's an allegory. Three Pines doesn't actually exist. Three Pines it's about goodness. It's about you. I live in Three Pines, you live in Three Pines when I choose decency over the clever comment, over the cutting comment, over finding flaws, which are so easy to find. Instead of seeing the flaw, just take a breath and see the grace, see the goodness, and maybe say something nice, say something kind. And that's Three Pines, and that's where I want to live. I'm tired of being cynical. I'm tired of being dark. I'm tired of finding flaws, which again, any idiot can find a flaw. They're not that hard to see. But there's a lot of peace and comfort inside us that comes from also seeing the goodness. Seeing the flaws and accepting that they exist. Like, bad people exist in this world. No use pretending they don't. But seeing the goodness as well. And that's what Three Pines is. When All the Devils Are Here came out, we were in the middle of the pandemic and the book tour. Normally I have thanks to Danny and Lucy, they organized this major launch here in the village, and people come from all over, from thousands of miles away. And we have a big village-wide celebration, and Danny and Lucy are fantastic. That wasn't possible, obviously, so it became a virtual tour. So I'm certainly hoping by the end of August, when the next book comes out, that I'll be able to tour again. Touring is a strange thing because I love meeting people. I love talking to people, thanking them for their support. talking about the books. But I'm tired of traveling. I don't mind hotels, actually. That's kind of fun. It's the flights. It's the getting on planes. Is it going to be delayed? And if there's a connecting flight, and oh my goodness, it can be wearisome. So I did not miss the traveling. But don't tell my publishers. So yes, I hope that it doesn't have to be virtual, but I also hope there won't be quite as much touring as there once was. But I can't tell you very much about the book just because, I don't want to. The phrase "surprised by joy," which actually plays a role in still life, is a C.S. Lewis quote. It's one of the titles of one of his books. And it was actually Michael's favorite quote, "surprised by joy." So I gave him a bench once, and it has "surprised by joy" on it. And not coincidentally, in the books, Armand and Reine-Marie have a bench made with "surprised by joy" written on it and put up on the hill outside of, leading into and down into Three Pines for people to sit and gaze at the vista. The joy's a funny thing, isn't it? C.S. Lewis talks about joy and said that we can create situations where we're happy. Eating a meal, being with friends, walking through a field, doing things that make us happy. We can make ourselves happy. Joy is a gift. Joy is something else entirely. You can't necessarily manufacture joy. And I believe that. I think that there are, I'm a happy person, even despite what's happening, even with what happened. At my center, there is happiness. But joy is something else. Joy. I'll feel joy when, at the oddest moments. Writing is an interesting process, and it's not necessarily joyous. It can be quite difficult, but at the same time, it's very rewarding. It's an amazing feeling to be doing what I believe I was always meant to do. And doing it not because there's something special about me, but doing it because I happen to be extremely fortunate and very lucky. And many people get angry or upset or stressed when I talk about luck and the role luck has. And I see that maybe it doesn't. Maybe I've got it wrong. But I see how many things have happened in my life and had to happen for me to be where I am. First of all, being born in Canada. That you can't tell me that's not lucky. Meeting Michael, marrying Michael, loving Michael, having Michael love me, being able to write these books, having the freedom to do it, having the education to do it, having, the illiteracy rate is shocking and so limiting for people. And I'm lucky that through nothing that I personally did, I was given a good education. So I'm aware of all that, and that I get to do what I love, which isn't to say it's always easy. It's not, and I think that's part of the enjoyment of it. Is I feel good when I've done something that's been difficult, that I haven't just taken the easy and softer way. That I have. It's been a struggle. Almost every day it's a struggle. But I do it anyway, and at the end of the day, I feel good about myself for having done what's difficult. So, does it give me joy? Sometimes, but it's not something I expect. I'll be walking through my house, and I'll just be overcome with it, and then it'll wash away. It just brushes by, gives me a little kiss, and moves on to the next person. But I have the sign out my back the yard now, and it was made by a friend, and it says "Surprised by Joy," and I look at it every day. I also have by the front door, just where I live, so I see it every time I leave, the final words of the poet Seamus Heaney. And on his deathbed, the last thing he said, and it was to his wife, he said, "Noli timere," which means be not afraid. Be not afraid. And for someone where fear has been a constant companion, I need to remember every day I write, every day I leave the house, every day I pick up the phone, every day I write an email, is be not afraid. Just be yourself. Don't be afraid. Thank you so much for having me in your homes. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening to me. I've really, really enjoyed this. Thank you for that. And if you feel like you have stories that you want to tell, fortunately, the next episode happens to be on creative writing.
When the sun is bright, or in the darkest night, we're all in this together. I've got many friends, and you are one of them. We're all in this together. It will be okay. Ça va bien aller. I've got many songs to sing. Won't you sing them too? I'll see you again at the rainbow's end, in fair or stormy weather. For love is like a smile that says see you in a while. We're all in this together. It will be okay. Ça va bien aller. I've got many songs to sing. Won't you sing them too? Sing them too.